The oil industry is often called out as a driver of climate change, but what did they actually do? Well, the oil industry has been deceiving the public on climate change for decades, trying to convince us that climate change was not urgent and that the science behind it was insufficient. You might ask yourself, if climate change threatens everyone, wouldn't the oil and gas industry, run by people who live on this planet too, want to protect the Earth? Why would they spend decades trying to convince us that climate change isn't real or that nothing could be done? The answer is simple as it is devastating. They knew the truth, but they chose profit over people. They chose deliberate deception to continue lining their pockets for decades. A perfect example of this deception comes from the oil and gas mogul ExxonMobil, a major fossil fuel producer. Throughout the 1900s, climate change was beginning to garner attention by the scientific community, and heavy attention was put on it in the late 1900s. In 1977, James F. Black, a senior scientist at Exxon, warned executives that increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide could alter the climate of the Earth. During this time, Exxon and other companies were attending congressional hearings discussing the relationship between greenhouse gases and global warming. By the 1980s, the evidence behind climate change and the effects of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere became clearer and harder to dispute. In fact, starting around this time until the early 2000s, the company began developing modeled projections of how fossil fuels would impact the climate. So far, we've seen that these models have been shockingly accurate and predicted nearly the exact warming trend we've seen within an extremely small margin of error. Evidence continued to build throughout the 80s, and it became overwhelmingly clear that climate change would be a problem. By 1988, Exxon had recognized this mounting evidence, so they delivered an internal memo to the company laying out a strategy to cast doubt on the severity of climate change. In the first few lines of the memo, Exxon spokesperson writes, "The greenhouse gas effect may be one of the most significant environmental issues for the 1990s, and the principal greenhouse gases are byproducts of fossil fuel combustion." But despite this acknowledgement, the company had to develop a plan. How could they maintain profits despite the science behind climate change? Simple. Deny, deny, deny. Not the existence of climate change, but the science behind it. Their plan was to make climate change seem distant and unimportant by casting uncertainty on its severity. In the memo, the spokesperson emphasizes that climate models are not very reliable because approximations are used to represent poorly understood interactions. It is too early to specify the severity of potential impacts of the enhanced greenhouse effect. And the key position sent to Exxon executives emphasized the uncertainty in scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect. If we think back to this period of time, maybe this seems valid. I mean, how can they be certain in the reliability of these models? Well, this isn't really the issue. The problem is in the way Exxon is framing the issue around the science. By saying not very reliable or uncertain, the memo implies that climate models can't be trusted at all. But this isn't true. The models were clear that there would be warming, it would be severe, and it would come from greenhouse gases. The uncertainties in these models at most would broaden the range of predicted warming, not the direction of warming. For instance, using uncertain assumptions, some models would predict 2 degrees of warming, while other models would predict 4 degrees of warming. But despite this range of projected increases in temperature, it's still clear that the Earth would warm, and Exxon knew this. But they rode this uncertainty train as long as possible, denying the severity of climate change to protect their profits. By the 1990s, Exxon had founded and joined groups like the Global Climate Coalition, a group vested in protecting fossil fuel interests that supported well-known climate skeptics who were branded as climate experts. For reference, we're talking about people like Patrick Michaels, who bet in 1999 that a global cooling trend would occur throughout the 2000s, and that the world would go 25 years without seeing any warming. Around this time, Exxon also hired Brian Flannery, who worked with various universities to improve climate projections, and he told these researchers to embrace the uncertainty in all of this. By 1998, the oil industry was formulating a strategy to drill down this uncertainty in the science behind climate change. In a leaked document developed by the American Petroleum Institute, the industry laid out their plan. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science, and media understands uncertainties in climate science. To achieve this, companies like Exxon spent the next few decades developing advertorials to emphasize the uncertainty of climate change to the public, despite the unequivocal evidence mounted behind it. Scientists like Geoffrey Supran have sifted through tons of these oil industry documents and advertorials, finding that while over 80% of scientific articles on climate change acknowledge its importance and urgency, nearly 80% of all advertorials developed by oil companies cast doubt on it. In fact, Supran's research shows that as documents within the oil industry become more publicly accessible, more doubt is cast on the seriousness of climate change. From this graph, we see that internal memos, documents only seen by executives within the oil company, primarily acknowledge the seriousness of climate change. The vast majority of peer-reviewed documents, or those reviewed by scientists, also showed a similar trend. However, as we see documents that are more accessible by the public, especially advertorials developed by oil companies, doubt is cast on the seriousness of climate change. Just take it from one of Exxon's scientists studying the effects of their actions.
I was greatly distressed by the climate science denial program that Exxon's front office launched around the time I stopped working as a consultant. The advertisements that Exxon ran in major newspapers raising doubt about climate change were contradicted by the scientific work we had done and continued to do. I cannot see into Exxon management's heart. Whatever its intent, willful ignorance, stymieing an effective response to preserve quarterly profits, they deliberately created doubt when internal research confirmed how serious a threat it was.
But this doesn't even cover all of the oil industry's actions in the public sector. Over the last few decades, Exxon has given over $35 million to various climate-denying organizations. But surely not the government, right? The oil industry funneled over $219 million into the 2024 election to protect their profits. Exxon alone gave over $1.5 million to members of Congress and corporate lobbying groups in 2022. Remember our friend Jim Inhofe from the beginning of the video? The one that called global warming the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people? Yeah, well, he received over $20,000 just from ExxonMobil. By the way, he's infamous for bringing a snowball onto the Senate floor to prove that climate change could not be real. Because how is there snow here? What a really smart guy. I definitely trust him when it comes to the climate. This amount of money allows the oil industry to play puppeteer with our Congress people, who are also money motivated. It's just a small price for the industry to pay to continue exploiting us for profits. By the early 2000s, warming trends and the accompanying science and projections became too clear to continue casting uncertainty. Exxon, Chevron, and all other oil companies once again had to shift their position. Instead of denying the severity of climate change, the industry began finding ways to delay fossil fuel reductions. Now, without outright denying the science, the company developed specific rhetoric to frame the issue of climate change as one that is not immediately pressing. But what does this reframing of rhetoric mean? Well, it all has to do with the words the industry uses when it talks about climate change. The industry's new favorite word quickly became risk. Advertorials were sent out by companies talking about addressing climate change risks, or discussing the risks to society and ecosystems from climate change. The word risk is ambiguous and softens the blow of climate change. Compare this to the word danger. If someone came up to you and said, "Your child is in danger," you would start freaking out. But what if that same person came up to you and said, "Your child's at risk"? You'd be like, what? At risk of what? It softens the blow and aims to confuse the severity of climate change in the hopes that you won't ask more questions. But how did these canny little oil companies come up with such a clever strategy? Let's not give them that much credit. In fact, they don't deserve any credit. They stole this from the tobacco industry. You know, the one that used to say cigarettes are not harmful, or maybe even good for you, and then transitioned to highlighting the risks of smoking cigarettes when it became obvious that they were bad for you? These two industries are literally mirroring the same tactics. They know that the science is unequivocal, so they're training our brains to tune out the science and soften the immediacy of climate change. After the industry started employing these rhetorical strategies, they had to think of ways to reduce their culpability as drivers of climate change. If people started identifying them as the cause of climate change, not only would their profits be hurt, but devastation could be wrought on the entire industry. So they did what they do best, and they took another play out of the tobacco industry's book. Just like the tobacco industry, the oil industry began redirecting blame for climate change at consumers. How could we be the ones to blame when we're just the middleman providing oil and gas for people? Consumers are the ones buying it, so how is it our fault? Well, Yeah, that might make sense if you didn't spend 4 decades protecting your own profits by denying the science and intentionally leaving people misinformed on the decisions they were making. In fact, oil companies were involved in a lawsuit a couple of years ago for their role in altering the climate, and they argued that they had no duty to warn when they say, the alleged impact of fossil fuel use on the global climate has been open and obvious for decades. Wait a minute, decades? You mean the same decades you were saying that the science behind climate change is uncertain and shouldn't be trusted? This idea of consumer blame has infiltrated so deep into normal society that we don't even notice it when we see it. Did you know that the idea of a carbon footprint was created by British Petroleum, a UK-based oil company? Don't get me wrong, I think the idea of a carbon footprint is not inherently bad. We can still make individual changes that promote a better climate. But this is such an obvious shift of blame, it's hard to ignore. This carbon footprint was literally created to make us feel like we're the ones to blame, despite oil companies deliberately deceiving us to keep profits up. During this time, oil companies also had to develop a strategy to stay in the game, with renewables becoming cheaper and potentially more economical. They used a strategy of delay called fossil fuel solutionism, the idea that fossil fuels are not only necessary for society, but that they can still be used while the problem of climate change is solved. This idea began pushing the industry to develop technologies that could mitigate fossil fuels. One of these is known as carbon capture and storage. Oil companies use this technology to push the idea that we can mechanically remove carbon from the atmosphere and pump it underground. It sounds like an amazing idea. The only problem is that it's incredibly expensive and will not be a viable option for at least a few decades. But this is a key aspect of delay. Make us think that they're solving the problem or have a solution to the problem. Meanwhile, they have no intention of solving it and are just squeezing as much more money as they can out of us.